Thank you for listening to Tapping Into the Human, a podcast on addiction, recovery, and mental health, brought to you by the Albertus Project. By tapping into the human behind addiction and mental health, we can empower those suffering by creating a culture of empathy and support. Every week, you'll hear powerful stories from people about their journey with recovery and be inspired by individuals and organizations that are leading the charge in decreasing the stigma surrounding mental health and addiction.
Hey all, welcome to the next episode of Tapping Into the Human. Very excited today to welcome Dr. Vera Tarman, who is been reaching out to the medical and addiction communities through various workshops and her speaking engagements. She speaks on the topics of the science behind food addiction and why we use food for comfort. She has educated thousands of people across the world, and we hope having her on today helps to educate myself and the rest of you listening. So Dr. Tarman, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you for asking. That's great. I'm prepared to talk about food addiction or just general addiction.
Perfect. And that was actually going to be my first question. So obviously it was going on your website. And as I'm new to learning about addiction, the past however many months I've really been on this sort of learning journey, I haven't even thought about food addiction, and I don't fully know what that means. Can you explain to me and sort of the rest of the listeners what really is food addiction?
Okay, if I can just back up a little and give some context, like the reason why you don't know very much about food addiction.
Sure.
You know, I'm an addictions physician, and I've been in the field now for since I guess the 1990s, something like that. And my focus was mainly alcohol and cocaine, because that's the sort of people that were seeking treatment.
Right.
And then in the last 5 years, we've been inundated by the whole opiate crisis. And so now if you say addiction medicine, people will think opiates. Of course, there's marijuana too, and cigarettes, but those are the sort of three big ones. But the idea about food addiction has been kind of relegated to the sort of humorous, yeah, I'm addicted to chocolates, ha ha ha. It hasn't received the same, certainly not the notoriety of opiate addiction, because there are, young people like you are dying like just in a volume that we've never ever seen before of people dying from addiction. Cocaine and alcohol will kill people, but usually when they're older, and we sort of expect it on some level. But food addiction, actually the numbers, there's far more people who die of food addiction than of alcohol, cocaine, or opiates.
Really?
Or even maybe equivalent to cigarettes.
Wow.
It's just we don't call it food addiction. We call it diabetes. We call it high blood pressure. We call it obesity. But if you look at what are the predictors of those things, like whatever it is that makes you diabetic or obese or have high blood pressure, likely is the food that you're eating, and that is almost always sugar. So when I say food addiction, I primarily mean sugar or processed food addiction.
Got it.
And those we just don't name it. It's like the giraffe in the room or the elephant in the room, that we don't call it that. We call it something else. But if we were to call it that, because there's research to show, like historical research, sort of demographic research, that shows that diabetes did not exist to the extent that it does today. Your generation, it's like 1 in 10 people, or maybe 15 people. In my generation and previous, it was 1 in 100. Like there's a huge spike, and it's because of the spike of food. So food is people know I shouldn't be eating this stuff, but they can't help it.
Right.
So it's that piece there that we're not calling it addiction, but it is, and we have to stop laughing about it. So here I am on the campaign. Like, I'm happy that you're asking me to speak, because I'm willing to speak to whoever will listen, to mainly say this is a valid condition, and you will die of this addiction. It's just it'll take a long time. It won't be tomorrow because of an
Compounding.
And it'll be over time, and we'll call it something different. We'll call it mental health, depression, suicide. We'll call it diabetes or heart attack or stroke. But those, yes, we all have to die of something, but we don't need to be dying or sick in our 50s and 60s. And that's because of the food. And because everybody knows they shouldn't be eating it, it's because of the addiction. So that's my long context.
Well said. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And so how did you get into this sort of specialty? This is what you specialize in now, from what I see. What made you decide? It was just the fact that it's not really talked about? It's even more stigmatized than other addictions. Like, what made you get into this specific field?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's more stigmatized, it's just dismissed. That's the
Mm,
killer. Like the worst thing to do to somebody is not to despise them, it's to not even notice that they're there. And that's
yeah.
what we're pissed off about. But my personal experience, I mean my professional experience is that I as an addictions physician saw people coming into treatment, young people, old people, doesn't matter, they put down their drug, whether alcohol, cocaine, opiates, whatever it was, and what did they do? They started eating. And they would say to me often, I don't know why I'm eating so much. I'm eating 10 chocolate bars a day. I'm eating all the donuts. I'm eating the boxes of the chips that are come out at night in treatment. I never used to do that. And then I saw that there was this transfer of addiction, because we basically say in the addiction world, it's all about the dopamine in the brain. And these substances are just doorways, gateways into that sort of addiction pathway, and the whole dynamic of that. And so I saw that on a repetitive basis in my work, and I just kept thinking, you're okay, you're clean, you're walking out of the treatment center, you're not using your cocaine anymore, however you're eating now, and soon enough you're going to want to go on a diet because you don't want to gain that weight. And people would laugh and say the Jenny Crack diet, they
Mm.
went back to their drug because they didn't want to gain the weight. They didn't see that it was the addiction to the sugar. um, I also have my own personal story in that I, like so many other young women in their 20s, was worried about my weight and basically tried to control it by restricting, starving. The fancy word for that today is intermittent fasting, by the way. And for anybody here who is listening that is interested in that, don't use intermittent fasting as a form of weight control, because although it has many health benefits, that's not one of them. And what happens is people develop an eating disorder, which is they fast and then or restrict, and then they end up binging. And if there isn't an awareness of it's the food, it's not the amount of food,
Mm.
then you're the specific type of food, then you're going to get into trouble. And that's what happened to me. So I saw that, and then once I saw that and figured out it's the food that's causing this problem, and if I just basically treat it as an addiction, then I will be better. And that's in fact what happened with me, and then with all the people that I see who do this. They get better, so they actually can lose weight and keep it off, and whatnot.
Yeah, no,
Now,
that's, sorry, go ahead.
can I'm going on a lot here, but can I give sort of the definition of food addiction? Because that is
Please,
the question that you
please.
asked me at the beginning. And I'm
Yeah.
giving most of this info at first ahead of time. But the definition of addiction, so anybody who's listening, wondering, and if you think, oh, food, how can you be addicted to food? You might be more willing to hear the idea of sugar addiction. So basically, it's just there's different parameters or criteria for addiction, and it will work for cigarettes, it'll work for drinking if you're worried about your drinking, your cocaine use, or your occasional Percocet use, like whatever it is that you're doing. Are you finding that you're, including food, are you finding that you're focused on it a little bit too much in the day? Like mental real estate is all around, I can't wait till I get home and then I can crack open that bottle of wine and relax, or break open the box of cookies or the takeout, and close the doors, and I'm finally relaxed. And that focus on that as a sort of means of comfort, that's a first thing. And then the second thing, it's chronic and it's progressive. It would be nice if just a few cookies or a drink at night would do the trick, but it never does. It only works for a while, and then you need 2 and 3 and 4. And if you find that process is happening, we actually call that tolerance. You're becoming tolerant to the effect, and now you need a couple more, or 3 more, or 4
Right.
more, just to feel like that little bit of boost. And then once that starts happening, problems emerge. You're starting to gain weight, or you're starting to, if it's drinking, call in sick the next day. Things are starting to happen around you that are what we call impairment. So are you starting to fantasize or focus on it too much? Are you starting to get impairments? Are you needing more? And then finally say, I got to stop because I've gained 10, I'm now 200 pounds and I want to stop. And you can't stop, because now how do I live that night without my tub of Haagen-Dazs that I've had every other night?
Exactly.
Or what chocolate bar to get through the day. And that's actually the fear of withdrawal, which is a withdrawal. People say there's no withdrawal, there is.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last thing, I'll just end with this, is that so we have all those criteria, and then the last one is this thing we call denial, which is it's not that bad. I can manage. I'm just going to have the rest of the cookies and I'll start tomorrow, or I'll start on New Year's Eve. It's really not that bad. You're going to find that you're going to be doing that forever. It's a sort of delusional piece that's attached to addiction. And if you can build all those criteria, you can say, I'm getting close to being, or worried about being, a food addict, sugar addict.
Interesting. No, I appreciate you sort of guiding me through that process. So, question for you: what is the typical treatment for sugar or food addiction? I mean, I've been doing a ton of research on, AA and NA and other smart recovery, Women's for Sobriety.
Yeah.
I don't know if those would be good mechanisms for people who are dealing with like a sugar addiction. What is the typical treatment?
No, they absolutely are. So first of all, you might have to decide, am I just a quote recreational user? It's like the person who can have a few cigarettes and they're not stuck all the time. And so, if you can just cut down, so if you can just cut down, then you don't need any of that other stuff. And in the 12-step world, we call this step one. Do I actually see that I'm powerless over this, or can I manage a few?
Right.
If you realize, no, I can't, and I am powerless, then the ultimate solution then it's going to be one of two. Am I going to do a harm reduction approach, which is just try to moderate, just have a few every once in a while? But I'm going to tell you, the problem with the harm reduction approach is you're cutting down, but you're just going to want, even though you're not having, you're still aware that there's a bit more ice cream in the freezer, and that's the focus. You might not be eating it, but it's still robbing you of peace of mind. So the best solution, if you can do it, is to say, this is a triggering substance. Yes, it is. Sugar is. I'm going to not eat it anymore. Throw it out of the house. And then the next step is you're going to feel deprived and depressed and angry. That's all the withdrawal piece. And the whole point about the 12-step programs, of which, yes, there is one for, there's actually 10 of them for food, because
Really?
yeah, there's the initial one.
I want to do a whole bunch of research on that, because I was going to say, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I don't think, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, that's well known that there are so many treatment programs for food addiction.
Well, I wouldn't say treatment programs. I would say 12-step programs. So
12-step
treatment programs, because it's not acknowledged as a medical thing, it's not funded. And so people who want to hang out their shingle and say, I'm a food coach or I'm a food counselor, can't get OHIP funding. They can't get any kind of funding like that. And that's a real big time deterrent.
Right.
So in the community, we have 12-step programs, and there was one, OA, which started in the 1960s. AA started in like 1940. OA, Overeaters Anonymous, started in the 1960s. And then since then, so OA is sort of like, you admit that you're powerless over your eating behavior. There's some programs that say, yeah, that's true, but you know what? We need to add an extra piece to that. Here's a specific diet that you have to follow. And so you'll have something called Food Addicts Anonymous. Food addicts, there's another one called Gray Sheet Anonymous. There's a number of them that have specific food plans with specific requirements, like you got to call somebody every day. Here's an example: a day in the life of a food addict. You figure out day before what you're going to eat the next day, write it all down, call it into what we call, it could be a food coach or a sponsor, where you say, okay, Alex, I'm going to eat for breakfast, I'm going to have 4 ounces of chicken or not cereal, because that's a processed food. We're looking at unprocessed stuff, yogurt or berries, and for lunch I'm going to have 4 ounces of chicken, and I'm going to have a bunch of cauliflower, and then for dinner I'm going to have 4 ounces of steak or maybe some kind of bean product with whatever, and that's what I'm going to have. And you're going to say, yeah, that looks okay, and have you checked that there's no sugar in this? And the food plans are usually basically unprocessed food, so you can't be doing all sorts of fancy Atkin bars and
Lucky Charms and all
that.
that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's so you've got like structure, designating what are your trigger foods, and then we usually really strongly advocate that you have a social support. And the reason why that's so important is because if I go out there in the world, we're social animals, we absorb everything. And if I go out there in the world and say, I don't want to eat sugar, and I have 10 people, which I will if I announce, I usually don't say anything because I don't want the hassle. But if I announce, I don't want to have sugar here, I'm at this party or wedding, I'm going to have 10 people going, why? Like, why? And so I need to have 10 people who are going to say, Good, Vera, you're
Good for
right.
you. Yeah, exactly. Like on your team, on
Exactly.
your side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, to kind of buffer the social negligence about this addiction.
For
Yeah,
sure. Yeah. Wow. I was gonna say. I mean, it's so interesting, and I think, I was speaking to someone recently, talking about sex addiction, and it's interesting to me. Like we were
right.
talking about how there's like levels of like, heroin. Oh, that's like a really bad addiction. Sex addiction, something you don't even talk about. And all
Yeah,
the amazing people that I've chatted with over the last 7 months, I've never spoken about food addiction. It's just not really a thing. So, and I think it's
yeah.
interesting that you just mentioned it's not really recognized as like a
No.
legitimate addiction. What do you think is sort of the solution to that? Like that there seems to me like some sort of a government action is needed, or a medical community action to sort of label it as a legitimate thing. What do you think should be done?
We've been talking like the 1960s. OA has been around for that long, and people in the community. There's been small pockets here and there that have worked in this field, but we haven't managed to hit the big time of the clinical clinics, and then the big time of like the Oprahs who are talking about Weight Watchers. That was her deal. Weight Watchers does not. It just says cut down your foods. It doesn't say cut down specific triggering foods. Like it's not the same thing. But we've been very grateful because of in the last 10 years, this food movement that has nothing to do with food addiction, but it's the same food plan, and that's the keto and the paleo. And keto and paleo, they define themselves as really low carb or almost no carb. And so, where are most of the addictive foods? In the carbs. So there they are promoting a food addiction plan without even calling it that. And so we've been kind of piggybacking on them, and
Mm.
I'm really grateful to them. And now that they've been around long enough, sure enough, they're starting to have failures. That's only because they don't realize that there's an addictive piece. And so you get those crazy little tricks around, like I can make a cheesecake, keto cheesecake, whatever it is.
Right, 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 right.
You're a food addict, that's just going to trip you up, whether it's sugar or not. So we catch them and say, keep doing what you're doing, just cut out the keto cheesecake, and then you'll be okay. So I think that's what's going to make the difference. And we do have some people now writing about obesity, and that's the other avenues we're getting in, is saying this isn't a treatment for obesity. So that's my hope for the future, that we're going to break into some of these areas and find our niche in there.
Right. Okay. No, that sounds good. You've also written a book called "The Truth About Food Addiction." Can
Yeah.
you explain to our listeners sort of a little bit about what inspired you to actually like publish a book about this topic?
Yeah, okay. So the book is called Food Junkies. There's two editions. The first one was called Truth About Food Addiction, and then the second, Recovery from Food Addiction. And I wrote the sort of the first one about 6 or 7 years ago now, and it was really to get the science of that time. It's been upgraded in the second one, and the clinical experience, which is not being written about. So I'm a doctor, and I have clinical experience. It's not being written about because it's not being acknowledged. And I thought we need to have some actual like stories, some actual experience that people can see that, yeah, okay, so now I read the science, I read the story about how it works, what, like the definition, like I described the treatment, and then people get it. And I've got to say that most of the people that have read that will put the book down and go, now I know what you're talking about. I actually, maybe I'm a food addict. I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
is. And it's not that bizarre when you actually break it down. And that's what the book does.
For sure. No, I think that that's an excellent point that you make, and I think that that sort of goes for addiction in general, where
Yeah,
I sort of sometimes think that people are scared of addiction, right? Because
yeah,
people are miseducated, uninformed, all that sort of stuff. And I feel like there's a chance, well, if you actually do a little bit of research, you can find some things that you might not want to know about yourself or your loved ones,
right, right.
right?
You know
So,
what? If we can do, which is exactly what you're doing with your podcast, if we can destigmatize this concept of
exactly.
addiction and make it something like, oh, geez, maybe this is something, so that we're not going to hate the person that is, we see it in ourselves, like you said, then we're going to get a lot further. And people will say, you don't want to call somebody who's an obese and addict, you're just giving them two more, another stigmatic. I just say, well, stop stigmatizing it.
Exactly.
How is it any worse than being depressed or anxious
Right.
or attention deficit? It's on the same level, except it's more devastating if we don't acknowledge it.
Exactly. And that's what I've been seeing is, sort of what we were just chatting about before, the different levels of stigmatization and what's allowed and what's not allowed. And I feel like we're at a point where mental health is in a much better space, but obviously, unfortunately, addiction is not.
Like you see on Facebook, they have that mental health day where
Mental Health Awareness Day, yeah.
We need something like that for addiction so that people can, freely admit, and then it's not in the dark anymore, and that's where it feeds and gets worse.
Yeah, no, exactly. And interesting you say that. Last week was International Overdose Awareness Day, and it's been happening every year for many, many years. And I never heard about it until Reed passed away, and I've now taken this up as, a passion of mine. But it just sort of goes to show I'm always online. I'm always on social media. No one in my circle ever posted about that day, but my friends, and you can make like your stories and Facebook profiles about like Mental Health Awareness Day. And it goes to show, and really that's the point of all this is,
yes,
I don't want to say infiltrate, but infiltrate people like me who are just really not on the bandwagon, so they can sort of start seeing these words and it's not as like scary when you first see it,
Absolutely, because in my generation, when I was your age, I'm sorry to say that, I'm starting to say that now all the time. The idea of mental health was super stigmatic. Like you just did not say that, and it's definitely different now. Like you're on medication, you would never say that, and it's very different now. So that would be a good thing. I mean, you know what I would love, because I think food addiction is on the same level as sugar, or sugar addiction is on the same level as like cigarettes. It's not a big thing, but it's got its teeth in people, and it's hard to quit. And also doesn't kill you right away. It kills you in 15 or 20 years. I would love to see this. This would be my my wish list. Big thing is if like now when people want to have a cigarette, they have to go outside on the patio because you don't want it in the house.
Exactly.
I would love to see people have to go out and take their dessert out of the patio.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say, no, that's such a good point. Okay, well, Dr. Tarman, I always ask the last question, and I get some really interesting, cool responses. What would be your words of wisdom to leave the audience with today?
Sugar addiction is real. If you struggle with not being able to, you don't want that next cookie, or you don't want to finish the bag, and you don't hate yourself for it. If you're starting to gain weight and you're starting to hate yourself for it, it's not you. It is the food industry that has done this. And in my day, we used to say the personal is political. Take it out of the realm of your personal self-loathing and anger and make it political. Stop food. I don't overeat on Brussels sprouts, but I overeat on food, big food. So take it out of the personal and make it political.
Excellent. Well said, Dr. Tarman. Well, thank you so much for being on today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. By tapping into the human behind addiction and mental health, we can empower those suffering by creating a culture of empathy and support. You can find more episodes of Tapping Into the Human and resources about addiction and mental health by following the Albertus Project on social media at Albertus Project and at www.albertusproject.org. Thank you.